Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Institute for Government. My name is Peter Riddle. I'm the director. The event this evening marks the publication of our open letter on civil service reform, and we're delighted to welcome Francis Maude, the Minister for the Cabinet Office, and the dual leadership team of Sir Jeremy Heywood, the Cabinet Secretary, and Sir Bob Kerslake, the head of the Civil Service, who took on their new roles at the beginning of this year. The open letter was published this morning, and you've all got copies on your seats. It's a collective IFG effort coordinated by Peter Thomas, to whom I'm most grateful for all the versions we've gone through. The letter sets out the challenges facing the civil service at a time of unprecedented cuts in staff numbers and radical reform of the role of the state, particularly in provision of public services. The civil service has changed considerably for the better in the past 30, indeed 10 years. We don't underrate those advances, but our work has identified a number of weaknesses which are widely acknowledged and sensed by on all sides, notably in achieving value for money, in providing adequate management information, the subject of a forthcoming report, in policy making, which we've already addressed in the report, and above all in capabilities, knowledge and skills. There are also big issues of the accountability of ministers and civil servants, both within Whitehall and in relation to Westminster. We believe that addressing these issues requires a new approach to leadership, not only by Jeremy and Bob, but by the civil service leadership generally. The IFG is undertaking research and working closely with decision makers in Whitehall on many of these issues, and plans to continue to do so in order to support reform and fulfil its objective of promoting effectiveness in government. The stakes are high. Success will inevitably mean a smaller civil service, but one which is clear about its core functions, with stronger capabilities in financial management, commercial skills, leadership of change, and so on. Civil servants will be more personally accountable. There is a prize of a high quality, high morale, highly effective civil service. But unless reforms are urgently introduced, there's a real risk of a downward spiral of cuts, inadequate services, and a demoralised civil service. Tonight, I'm wearing a tie based on that wonderful series of frescoes painted by the Lorenzetti brothers in the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena. I thought it was appropriate for tonight. It was once the subject of the Treasury's Christmas card, showing the mordant sense of humour of the Treasury. On adjoining walls are allegories of good and bad government. The contrast between concord and peace on one side and discord and pestilence on the other is very striking. And at least one of the characters bears a resemblance to Bob.
Which definitely on the good side.
Of course, naturally on the side of concord and good government. Just a couple of practical points. Tonight's event is being videoed and will appear on the IFG website by tomorrow lunchtime. The event is on the record. We welcome comments by Twitter. The hashtag is civil service reform. It shows how original we are here. The order of speakers will be first Francis, then Jeremy, followed by Bob. Then there will be time for questions, and I'll explain the format for questions when you arrive there. So first, I'd like to welcome Francis Maude.
Peter, thank you very much. It should be stressed that the order of speakers is in no respect an indication of their importance relative to each other. I'd just like to start by saying how valuable this exercise is that the Institute has done. I'm a huge fan of the Institute. I think David Sainsbury did a massive service to Britain's political and governmental system in setting this up, 4 years ago now? And has done a huge amount of incredibly valuable work. And I think we all benefit from that. And it's invaluable that as we embark on a process of civil service reform, that we have this expert and objective, dispassionate analysis to help inform the work. Difficult but important work that lies ahead. I had a very long sabbatical from government. I was liberated by the electors in 1992 after 7 years in government. Came back 18 years later. And the civil service in that time had gone through many beneficial changes. The biggest change, I would say, was that the the specialist streams of activity, finance, HR, technology, which were typically done in those days by generalists. These now have well-developed and strong, not yet strong enough in terms of the clout they're given within Whitehall, but specialist streams. And they're not yet deep enough, but they are infinitely better and stronger than they were before. And the values which have always permeated the civil service are as strong and as vigorously upheld as ever. But I don't think there's anybody who believes that things are perfect and that we could just sit back on our laurels, because the world is a more difficult and demanding place for those in government than it's been for a long, long time. So things do need to change. And I want to focus on a couple of things this evening. But before I do so, I'd just like to say that as we've embarked on this programme of reform of the civil service, I've been enormously heartened and encouraged by the way in which the senior leadership of the civil service have embarked on this. I mean, those who make the mistake of believing that Yes, Minister was not a comedy but a training film might have thought that the inbuilt propensity of permanent secretaries in particular is to resist all change and to think that things are unimprovable. I think the leadership that Bob has given, and Jeremy, to this process, and the leadership they've given to the cadre of permanent secretaries, and the way in which permanent secretaries have engaged with the 5 theme groups that have been set up, has been immensely heartening to me, and the willingness to come up with really radical ideas, practical, crunchy, radical ideas, has been terrific. And I really would like to put that on record. What we're going to produce will not be an addition to the shelves in the libraries, which groan under the weight of unimplemented white papers on civil service reform. This is not going to be another Fulton report, an earnest study of how things could be better, most of which is still unimplemented 40 years later. It will be rigorously practical, with actions which can be put into effect, which will, we hope, when they all come together, make a significant difference. So I want to focus on 2 things which which will have come out to me from the first of them very vividly from the IFG report. And the first is around management information. And this first kind of three sources have brought this home to me as something which is of absolutely fundamental importance if we're to see sustained, continuous improvement. And the first was very early on when we invited Sir Philip Green to give us some thoughts about efficiency in government, particularly around procurement. And the report which he submitted to us, which I suspect was significantly sanitized from the way in which he certainly expressed it all orally to me in meetings, when I could get a word in edgeways, which wasn't often. But one of the key findings he made was, and I've got his words here, data is inconsistent and hard to get at, making it impossible to buy efficiently. Well, actually, the data that he was talking about there in relation to procurement and buying has begun to improve. We've got a much better handle today on what we spend money on, and the scope there is therefore to drive down the cost to government by buying more efficiently and by using the volume and scale of government is already coming through. But there's much more that needs to be done. He said this: the quality of data provided by departments is inconsistent. There needs to be a central mandate to provide accurate and timely data. And this is a theme that's been picked up vigorously by the group of non-executive board members who've been recruited in, very high-level, senior, experienced non-execs who have a lot of experience running big organizations. And the theme consistently comes through from them is that our data isn't good. It's really hard to know what's going on. Particularly financial management information is not available on a basis that's consistent and comparable between departments. And this makes it very difficult for people to be held accountable, either senior officials to be held accountable for what they do, or indeed for ministers to be held accountable, because one of the key things that we insisted on when we put in place the new arrangement for these enhanced departmental boards was that ministers need to be more engaged in the implementation of policies. No longer could we have this approach where ministers from some lofty area in Whitehall dispense policies and then hand them down to officials to go away and implement, because actually it's that way has, or from that approach, has led some of the most wasteful and disastrous policy failures of recent times. Our view very much is that the development and the implementation of policy need to be seamlessly knitted together, and ministers need to be actively involved in the boards, with secretaries of state chairing the boards, ministers on those boards, and they need to be confronted with good financial management information and other management information. And we would expect the Prime Minister, as he gets eventually on his iPad, the PM app, which has been talked about, actually developed at extraordinarily low cost by our highly skilled team in the Government Digital Service. But the key to it is not the app, actually, it's the information which lies behind it, which will need to populate it, so that he can hold his ministers to account, so that Jeremy and Bob can hold permanent secretaries to account for what the departments are doing, and that the boards can do the same. It's absolutely crucial that this happens, and this is a hugely important priority for 2012. And so I was very struck, Peter, that the IFG's report highlights this as the first item in the agenda for reform under the rubric of value for money. And I commend to everybody who hasn't yet had the time to read the letter in its entirety, paragraphs 16 to 20. And I just quote the final part of it. Greater need for urgency, given the fiscal situation, establishing a new priority on delivering value for money across all departmental spending means starting with permanent secretaries, I would say ministers as well, actually. Performance assessment of permanent secretaries should cover how well departments are equipped to, and indeed succeeding in raising value for money. These assessments themselves, and this is the crucial part of it, will need to be based on meaningful management information, benchmarking performance either with similar operations across the civil service or within the private sector. And if nothing else comes from this, and much else will, that will be a hugely beneficial advance. Just the other thing I would touch on, which is also related to value for money, and I've talked about this in previous speeches, around the issue of innovation and risk aversion, and the way in which behaviors, which we talk about the culture, but culture is all about behaviors, and you change culture by changing behaviors, not by trying to change the culture. But it is, in too many ways, inimical to innovation and change. When change is embarked upon, new things are tried, the system is adept at finding numerous and lengthy ways of questioning every aspect of that change to see whether the change could be done in a number of different ways, but rarely comparing the change with the status quo. And if we were to provide a fraction of the amount of scrutiny that gets applied to changes to the status quo, then we would have a better basis for driving forward value for money. Actually, no one's career ever suffers from continuing to preside over an inefficient status quo. But plenty of people's careers suffer from trying something new that didn't work. And we need to have a culture where people are encouraged to try new things, to try them quickly, to close them down if they don't work, and learn from the lessons. An open culture, a culture where people aren't blamed for trying something that doesn't work. Actually, we need a culture where people get blamed for never trying something that doesn't work. Because if you don't have innovations tried quickly, close down if they don't work, you never learn, you never make progress. And that's incredibly difficult to change. But it's absolutely essential that it does change, or we won't get the value for money, we won't get the progress that we so urgently need. Thank you.
And now I introduce Jeremy Heywood, described in the Mirror this morning as the most important man you've never heard of. Not leave you in this room. Jeremy.
Thank you very much. I'll try and be brief so we've got as much time as possible for questions. First, I want to join Francis in thanking you, Peter, and the Institute for organising this event, organising this process. Bob and I have been in our new roles now for about 2 months. We're hoping to produce this plan of action, this non-white paper, in 2 or 3 months' time. So this is a very good opportunity to take stock of where we've got to get your input into that process. We're trying to be very inclusive. We're trying to generate ideas through the whole civil service and beyond. So it's a very good opportunity today to get your feedback on where we've got to so far and to pick up some of the themes in your report. Second, I wanted to thank you again for the balanced tone of the document. I thought it was a really good piece of work, if I may say so. It struck a very positive tone, I thought, towards the civil service. I mean, we recognise very clearly we are a monopoly public service, and that we can talk about whether that monopoly should be. We should start to contest that with the policy contestability issue, which we're happy to discuss today. But basically, fundamentally, we are a monopoly public service at a time of great fiscal austerity. And we therefore expect to be sort of under pressure to account for ourselves and to improve the whole time. But that all said, it was nice to see in this document some very positive things about the civil service. You recognise that we are a modern, dynamic, diverse employer doing fantastically interesting work, important work for the country. And I think you also recognise we've changed in many cases for the better over the last 10 years, certainly over the 30 years, or nigh on 30 years I've been in the civil service. And it's good to see that written down because it's so seldom said by third parties. I think we made a really good start over the last 2 years of the new government. You've probably heard all the figures before, so I won't go on at them at length, but we've already, I think, notched up £5 billion of sort of efficiency savings. Oliver's got this meter that counts all the coalition agreement commitments. I think there are 399, of which we've already completely met 37%. So we're sort of driving hard on the sort of commitments set out by the coalition. The transition, first of all, from Blair to Brown, and from Brown to the coalition, these are two unusual transitions, which the civil service, I think, managed with considerable sort of efficiency and aplomb. Again, people don't notice when things go well, but those situations, both of which could have been very tricky to handle, were handled, I think, very skillfully by mine and Bob's predecessor, Gus, and all the civil service who were involved in that. And I think it's fair to say, although Francis will happily correct us, that we've quickly won the confidence of a new set of ministers after a long period of a Labour government. And we shouldn't just sort of ignore that. That's a great achievement. Many countries can't achieve that. We've achieved that. And I think it needs to be said time and time again. So without changing in any way our values, and in fact, I think we've succeeded over time in entrenching those in legislation, we've nevertheless managed to modernise and diversify and take on new tasks in an ever-changing world. And I think that tone was recognised in the report, for which many thanks. I just wanted to, before picking up 2 or 3 of the policy issues in the report, just wanted to remind everybody of the sort of challenges facing the civil service and the government at this point, because I think they are immense. And again, this is recognised in the report. First of all, we've got the economic challenge. I mean, we all know that we are bumping along the bottom, or we're either minus 0.1% or plus 0.1% in terms of GDP growth. Fundamentally, we're sort of flatlining at the moment. But the more fundamental problem is that compared to where we thought we were going to be in 2007, 2008, the economy is literally 10 or 15% smaller on a permanent basis than was assumed only sort of 4 or 5 years ago. And that's just not going to come back. That's growth that was assumed was going to be there. The level of GDP is permanently lower by that amount. And I think all the time we have to ask ourselves in the civil service, have we really sort of digested what that means for the level of public spending, the level of public sector wages, the ambitions of the country to achieve certain things? Of course, we know we're in a period of austerity, but that is a really fundamental shift in the slope, even if the slope hasn't changed, it's basically a fundamental change in the level of GDP, which has a profound impact, I think, on the way we approach our job. Flowing closely from that is the fiscal challenge. I mean, we feel in Whitehall that we've done an unbelievable amount of change in the last sort of 20 months. I think some departments have reduced their headcounts by 20%. On average, I think it's by about 10%. The whole civil service has shrunk by 10%, more than, I think your report, Peter, more than Margaret Thatcher achieved over years. We've done all that, but we're only about 25% through, maybe 30% through the first 4 years of the austerity programme. And I think the autumn statement reminded us that that may well have another 2 or 3 years extra to run on top of the 4 years we've been bargaining for. So basically, we're in a sort of, the starting point, frankly, 15, 20% maybe, into a sort of 7-year programme, at least, of fiscal austerity. And that means dramatic sort of reductions in headcount and so on. And I think, again, just it's easy to sort of gloss over the words and the numbers, but that is an enormous programme that is putting huge pressure on every single department in Whitehall. And it means we can't just sort of breathe a sigh of relief having got through this far and say, now we can relax, it's now time for business as usual. Business as usual is continuous improvement for the foreseeable future. It's like the best companies in the 1980s and 90s. It's a constant process of driving cost out year by year without damaging outputs and outcomes. And I think that's the world we're going to be in for the next sort of 5 to 10 years. Put that against the third challenge, the reform challenge. This is a government which is in a hurry, again, your report makes this clear, to achieve lots, not just in 1 or 2 areas a year. I remember the Margaret Thatcher's government achieved a huge amount year by year, picking off 2 or 3 really big issues, the national curriculum one year, reform of the BBC the next year, and so on. This government has embarked simultaneously on a huge reform of the education system, a fundamental reform of the national health system, a major change in immigration. Wherever you look, the welfare reform system, the police and crime commissioners, the criminal justice system, wherever you look, you just have to go to the House of Lords, you can see the reform battering away through the system. Pretty much everything's been thrown up at the same time. And that, again, is a huge sort of challenge for the civil service and the ministers to sort of grapple with day by day. And then the fourth thing, which is very closely related to the third, the constitutional challenge. I mean, we've been through a vigorous period of constitutional reform and debate over the last sort of 2 years, but yet we find ourselves now having to spend a lot of time on the future of the United Kingdom. I'm personally going to be spending a lot of time in the Union. We've got the House of Lords reform about to come out of the Joint Committee, and that could well dominate not just the next session of Parliament, but conceivably even the session after that. And also we've got this interesting mix of elected mayors, elected police and crime commissioners, possibly even elected national park officials. The country's going to look very different in the next sort of 12 months or 24 months anyway, as a whole series of these constitutional questions get sort of debated and resolved one way or the other, again, taking an enormous amount of time. So this is a civil service that's having to cope with all of those things at the same time. Huge economic pressure, big fiscal requirement to adjust and cut costs, but at the same time a huge ministerial appetite to change the country in rather fundamental ways, and possibly even the Constitution as well. So very big challenges, again, reflected in your report, but I think it's just very important to contextualise the rest of the debate by remembering all the time what it is we're trying to achieve. So finally, before handing over to Bob for a broader discussion of how we're handling the civil service reform programme, I just wanted to highlight the sort of 3 policy recommendations that you made in your report that I will be personally sort of engaging with as Cabinet Secretary. First, I was very pleased to see that the quality of policy making was one of your 6. It's too often in the past the sort of civil service reform programmes have focused on what I've sometimes pejoratively called the plumbing works, stuff that Francis gets out of bed every morning caring about. There's project management, efficiency, financial management, all those things, brilliant stuff, and it's absolutely vital that we push them through. But it's equally important that the civil service doesn't get complacent about its policy making. It's got to be fundamentally a world-class policy making outfit. Now, you've talked about design for implementation, which is obviously a very important part of that, and Francis has already talked too about the need for ministers to be more engaged in that process. But I'm equally concerned about other aspects of policy design. That's obviously a really important one, but I was very struck by when the new special advisors, my good friend Steve Hilton, who people think I'm at loggerheads with, which I'm certainly not, Steve brought in a whole series of impulses around nudge and transparency and payment by results and so on, which is a really rich policy agenda, some of which the previous government had been doing a bit of, some of which the civil service was already itself experimenting with. But I think it's fair to say that when the new government came in, they brought in lots of sort of energy and drive and creativity in this policy space. And I think the civil service has got to ask itself the question, why were we lagging behind a few special advisors and the incoming government in not thinking through whether some of these policy innovations could be really, really helpful for government? I'm not saying that all of them apply all the time, and some of them will be fairly marginal in some areas, but I think we've constantly got to ask ourselves the question, are we being innovative? Are we genuinely world-class? Are we resting on our laurels? How do we improve the policy-making process itself? And so I will personally be taking a great interest in that. The agenda on welfare and well-being and happiness, much derided, but really, really important, I think, over the next 10 to 20 years. I think the whole question of nudge, as I say, and transparency are very, very important. I've also put on the agenda one of David Halpin's ideas, I think, about a NICE for policy making. Simple idea, which is why aren't we much clearer which of these policy interventions to get people rehabilitated so they don't recommit crimes, early interventions to stop 3-year-old kids arriving at school unready for school. There's a whole array of experiments in policy that have been tried in America, here, elsewhere. We don't have a simple way of saying the evidence suggests these ones really do work and offer value for money, these ones don't. So we keep reinventing the wheel. Local authorities are wasting money, other commissioners are wasting money trying interventions which don't work. So let's try and use the discipline of the sort of fiscal tightness to really squeeze out bad policy making, be much clearer about where the evidence is pointing to us. The second area, the spending review. Now, on this one I part ways slightly. I think your report was a little unfair about the quality of the last spending review, which I think in many respects was a really superb exercise by the Treasury. And it delivered, and they're not just paying me to say this, it delivered, I think, some pretty sustainable budget changes and a fairly fundamental reallocation of spend from one department to another, very much in line with ministerial priorities, a particularly innovative approach to the way the capital budget was carved out. But I do accept that it was very departmental, very, very bilateral in that sense. It is true that we managed to dig out, as I said earlier, £5 billion of Cabinet Office-driven efficiencies. Pay restraint has contributed a huge amount to the overall envelope, which that's a fundamental cross-departmental policy. Similarly, the pensions reforms, the very fundamental public sector pension reforms that I think we've obviously spent a long time trying to get through, but I think standing back, they are a remarkable sort of change in the cost curve for the public sector pension. So I think it's true to say that there have been quite a few cross-departmental policies that were agreed as part of the last spending review. Nevertheless, we can always do better, and we can always come back to the difficult issue, which we've never really cracked, as to how to align more budgets around cross-departmental themes as opposed to departmental spend, and we can perhaps come and discuss that. But I don't think it was as bad as you maybe made out. And the third point I just wanted to sort of flag up as an issue of interest is this question about accountability to Parliament, accountability to ministers, and so on, and whether civil servants are inevitably going to become more personally accountable to Parliament. I think that we need an open debate about this, as you imply, Peter, in the letter. I'm personally a bit nervous about extending the role of the civil service and making clear that they're more personally accountable beyond the accounting officer role to Parliament, because I think that seriously blurs the line between the executive and Parliament. But I think there are some genuine questions around this. I think another question is the role of the civil service in helping the opposition plan for coming into government, as they would hope, in the last year before an opposition comes in. So I think we should be open to debating these questions, but fundamentally the civil service works for the elected government of the day, and I don't want to do anything myself that interferes with that and complicates it and has the civil service somehow suspended, working half for Parliament, half for its own ministers, half for the opposition. I think we need to be very careful about sort of making fundamental changes like that. But we could certainly look into issues around the personal accountability, making more public the objectives of permanent secretaries and maybe those sorts of issues. Bob and I, and Bob may want to come and talk about this, are intending to make much more use of permanent secretary objectives as a tool for driving sort of cross-cutting initiatives across Whitehall. Anyway, that's enough from me. I'll come back to some of these themes later. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thank you very much indeed, Jeremy. Stimulating lot. I think set at least 6 research projects here going. Bob.
Well, good evening, everybody. I have to say, with this packed room, I had never realised that civil service reform was so interesting. But perhaps the fact there are so many people here today just is testimony to the scale of the issues that we're facing, and I'll come back to that in a minute. I should also say, Peter, that I too have been to Siena and have a copy of those murals, and I will now do the equivalent of Find Bob on the pictures. I really hope it is on the good government side. Now, Francis has covered his vision for the civil service, and Jeremy has talked about the drivers for change. What I want to talk about this evening is the challenge of delivering civil service reform and how we're going about doing that. And I thought it would be useful to go back to the Northcote-Trevelyan report, all 22 pages of it. That's a challenge for us, Francis. Yes. Which set out the importance of the civil service in these words. It may be safely asserted that, as matters now stand, the government of the country could not be carried on without the aid of an efficient body of permanent officers occupying a position duly subordinate to ministers who are directly responsible to the Crown and to Parliament, yet possessing sufficient independence, character, ability and experience to be able to advise, assist and to some extent influence those who are from time to time set over them. Interestingly, it also continued, all, however, who have had occasion to examine its constitution with care have felt its organisation is far from perfect and that its amendment is deserving of the most careful attention. Interesting parallels. 158 years on, how much has changed? Well, it is tempting to see the civil service as an immutable organisation that has been unable and unwilling to change. But in reality, the civil service has changed dramatically at different times to reflect the changing needs and ambitions of government. So in the 1850s, the civil service existed simply to advise and regulate. By 1914, the civil service had begun to directly deliver core services. The huge expansion at the Second World War and the creation of the welfare state saw what might be seen as the high watermark in terms of the size of the civil service. And since then, there has been a steady reduction in the size of the civil service to its position now of 444,000. But I think if you look back at that historical parallel, you will see, and I don't think this is too much of an exaggeration, that the civil service now faces its biggest challenge since the Second World War. Put simply, the civil service has to implement a massive programme of public service reform, whilst at the same time going through profound changes itself. This almost unprecedented level of change has to be secured with substantially less resources, not more. And in undergoing the change, the civil service needs to both embrace change and at the same time to hang on to its core strengths and values. And for me, the scale and nature of the challenge is such that it has a very profound influence in the way in which we approach the task itself. There needs to be absolute clarity about the priorities for change and a very high level of support, not just from ministers, but also from the civil service itself. The case for change needs to be strongly articulated, and staff at all levels of the civil service have to be engaged in the process of change. Now, in a session like this, it's almost always the case that we focus on the shortcomings of the civil service, but we must also recognise its considerable strengths and indeed the improvements that have already been achieved. It seemed to me one of the most important things I should do as the new head of the civil service was to focus on providing visible leadership. And as part of that, I go out every week to meet with civil servants across the country. And what comes back to me is a very strong and enthusiastic group of people who are focused on the core values of the civil service. What they say to me is that the things that matter to them in the job are that they are doing something that is interesting and indeed something that makes a difference. And if you look at the staff survey results, 89% of staff say they're interested in their work and 75% say that they are sufficiently challenged. And what I think I would say is a relative newcomer to the civil service is that the civil service has huge strengths, a commitment to excellence, a concentration of talent, and an ability to change, becoming more open, more diverse, and more professional. But I think the other side of the job is not just to be a visible leader of the civil service, but also to champion change. And I think Jeremy has highlighted very clearly the reasons for change. And many of them come from not from the fact that we have intrinsic weaknesses in the civil service, although there are areas that we need to improve on, commercial skills, programme management, but because the world around us is changing so dramatically. The fiscal and economic challenge that Jeremy spoke about, the challenge from politicians both inside and outside government, the move towards commissioning in a more diverse delivery landscape, the drive towards greater openness and transparency, which I don't think will diminish, and the quite reasonable expectation that the civil service will match the best in other organisations, public and private, in the way that it manages itself. I think if we come up with a reform programme, it's really important that it goes with the grain of the changes that are already happening. The very impressive savings that Francis has talked about through the ERG reform programme, but most importantly for me, the enormous scale of change that is happening across the civil service in every single department. And I have the opportunity to talk to colleagues, and what comes across to you is that each one of the government's departments are fundamentally transforming the way they operate. And what we do as civil service reform needs to complement that, not cut across it. If, as the IFG report suggests, only 1 in 3 large-scale change programmes succeed, both the scale and the challenge and the scale of the change are such that the stakes here are very high. We have in the civil service the People's Survey, which is our direct challenge into the pulse of the civil service, direct channel into the pulse of the civil service. And what that tells us is that whilst there are many strengths, there are areas that we simply have to do better. For example, we can't accept that only 45% of our staff feel that learning and development activities improve their performance. We can't accept a situation where only 31% feel that they've got an opportunity to develop their career. And whilst we have some very good results in terms of engagement in many parts of the civil service, we have to recognise that, as the IFG letter states, only 27% of civil servants feel that change in the civil service is managed well. So if the civil service reform plan is to succeed, it needs to speak both to the external drivers that Jeremy spoke about and the ambitions of staff themselves to do better. And we must listen very much to the advice in Peter's letter about the things that have bedeviled previous reforms. Muddled thinking, a failure to appreciate the constraints of parliamentary accountability, a quasi-federal departmental structure, vested interests, and a lack of clear priorities and will. And for me, the key to success is that it is corporately led, building on the strengthened civil service leadership that Sir Gus introduced. And to this end, what we've done already is to establish a steering group chaired by Francis that brings together ministers, non-executives and officials. We've created a strengthened civil service board to take collective strategic civil decisions on behalf of the civil service, and we've formed 5 reform theme groups led by permanent secretaries, but drawing in talent across the civil service to drive the process of producing the plan and then implementing it. I personally think that IFG is a tremendous resource for us to have in the civil service, and I think there's much in the letter, as Jeremy has said, that we can support. In particular, the emphasis on value for money. And as Jeremy has indicated, we plan in each permanent secretary's objectives to build in the implementation of the efficiency and reform agenda and their department's contribution towards economic growth. The strengthening of relationships beyond the civil service. As somebody who's worked in an arm's length body, I know firsthand how much you can gain from collaborative working with the civil service, if you like, working across the boundaries. Raising capability and knowledge. This is an absolutely central issue that we have to address, and we're looking to do it through things such as the Major Projects Academy. But when we come to finish the plan, we need to answer some of these questions. As we move towards a smaller, leaner, more flexible civil service, what should the role of the civil service be? What will the future civil service look and feel like? And crucially, what will it mean to staff to be a civil servant? What constitutes excellent policy making in a world where we cannot rely on money, targets and regulation to deliver a government's goals? How do we ensure that we have systems that work effectively and support staff in their jobs? As I said earlier, the stakes are high. Our ambition must be to create a smaller but stronger civil service that meets the needs of government in a rapidly changing world. A lot depends on us getting this right. Thank you.
There you go.